news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, CORT 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. I'm so pleased today to have the guest that's joining us from the United Kingdom. Jilly Jenkinson, PhD, is an accredited psychotherapist, international speaker, and a director of Hope Valley Counseling. For over 25 years, Jilly has specialized as therapist and researcher in the challenges faced by those who have experienced coercive, cultic, and spiritual abuse. Jilly created post-cult counseling for those who experience trauma in such settings and trains therapists in its use. She is a former member of a Bible-based cultic group in the UK. Jilly's book, Walking Free from the Trauma of Coercive, Cultic, and Spiritual Abuse, a workbook for recovery and growth, will be published by Routledge in May 2023 and is available for pre-order. That is very exciting. Congratulations and welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think you're one of our first guests from the UK to join us on the show. So I'm really thankful to have you here. And I'm so interested in what your own experience was being part of a cultic group. Would you share with us anything about that time in your life?
Certainly, I will. I grew up in Uganda in East Africa, and it was such a beautiful country. And sort of my exposure to church and that sort of thing was, like Easter church services and Christmas and that sort of thing. Not really anything radical, just normal, but probably that there isn't such a thing as normal. And then I actually wasn't interested in religion. I went to British boarding school. So, of course, we had to go to church, which you probably don't know that, but we had to go to sort of Anglican church, Episcopalian in America, I think. And so, I always had this exposure to it. But when I was around 18, I was kind of targeted, really, I think now, as I look back, by a lovely young woman who really kind of obviously felt that she wanted me to join the church. And actually, some of the things she said to me, I felt very moved by. I think one of the things was that the level of certainty I was being told about. That if you become a Christian, you will have this certainty. You'll know where you go when you die. And I didn't really understand it all, but I think that on an emotional level kind of appealed to me. And I did resist her because she didn't think I should be smoking or seeing boys. So that was kind of some pushback. But I think she was so determined that in the end, I kind of capitulated and I gave in. And I went to a meeting and I became a born-again Christian. And some people will understand that whole process. And that really was the beginning of another whole journey. I mean, just a diversion from anywhere I was thinking of going. And it wasn't a cult, but I became very radical very quickly, from not being interested at all to being really kind of way over the top. And I remember my mother saying, "Oh, and you stopped wearing makeup," as if like this was like how weird, because I wasn't like that at all. So, and that whole journey took me through various different churches, and then eventually to a situation where I had quite a crisis in myself. And I was I guess I would say I was depressed, but nobody around me seemed to care or really understand. And at that time, I worked for a family as an au pair, so like looking after the children. I grew up in Africa. I didn't know about being an au pair, and I was totally out of my comfort zone. And I made this decision in myself at that point that I either, and this is very extreme, that either I wasn't a Christian after all, because I felt so terrible inside, or I had a demon, or maybe I was depressed. So, excuse me. So I was offered the option of going to see these two guys who could offer me counselling. So I went from one town in England to another town, and I had this counselling, and I never went back to my au pair job. I stayed. Wow. And I stayed for 7 years. So it was this sort of rather circuitous route. They told me probably that I had all three problems: demons, depression, and I needed them then, of course, to what, I don't know what. So I joined this group. I was very different because I grew up internationally, as I say, and I ended up in a sort of backwater in a British city. I was very different to the people who were there. My family were very alarmed because they were beginning to lose. I was moving further and further away. I moved from the south of England to the middle of England. My father had been in Belize, and after he left Uganda. So, and I ended up staying for 7 years. And I joined this what became a community quite quickly, actually. Probably within a year, it became community households, the idea that we were living out the New Testament lifestyle, all of that stuff. And it was all justified through that. And the leadership wasn't too controlling in the early days, but then probably within about 2 or 3 years, there was a guy, actually one of the guys who counseled me, he made a move, a power play, and he took over the leadership of the group.
Wow.
And it started to really, well, first of all, there was a whole big thing about image and how we looked to the outside world. He was contacting people. So back in the 70s, there was a whole community movement around the world. Lots of churches, lots of places were setting up community, not just hippie communes, but, other settings. And they had this kind of vision, always using this language. So we went into community. We shared a common purse. People who know the Bible will recognize that. So I had no money of my own. I made the choice to do it. I mean, I don't think they coerced me to do it, but I was already in that mindset where I, like my parents are like, oh, what are you doing? And they gave me a bit of money for my 21st birthday, and all of that went straight into the group. And gradually, this second leader really took power over the group, and it became exceptionally abusive. So it was a coercive control relationship. There was, there was physical beating for sin. I mean, it was really terrifying. And I was never in a leadership position. So I always felt really, how can I say, downtrodden, just under it all. And the only reason that the beating period stopped is because a journalist attended the community, and the leader was afraid that this might get out in the press. And so then he decided that everything, I don't want to use Christian terminology because I know it can be very triggering for people, but that this was all covered and it was in the past and it hadn't really happened. So we were having to use this kind of cognitive dissonance to kind of, this happened, but it didn't happen, which had the effect of silencing me and many other people and not telling people what had happened for years. So basically, sort of that period of time ended, and then I don't know quite how this happened, but some of the women who lived in the household with this leader who'd taken over, who had a lot of sexual stuff, he thought James Bond was the ideal Christian man. I mean,
oh dear.
I mean, you can't make it up, really. But I think they started to wake up a bit and to start to realize, I didn't, but they did. And there were about 6 or 7 women in his household. And they challenged him one day and he jumped out of, unfortunately, we always said, a ground floor window and ran off to try and get other people on his side. Typical narcissistic, you know.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of the end of the community. And within quite a short period, I started to wake up a bit myself, and I went back to my parents and I reflected what's happening. And I met my husband, Tony, in the group. And, you know, it's a long story, but we were kind of on different sides. You know, he'd realized that this leader was really off the wall and I hadn't. But then once I'd gone home, I came back to the community and I thought, yeah, this is wrong, I'm out. And then we decided to get married very soon after. Thankfully, I made a good choice. I could easily have been cult hopping at that point and just gone from one really traumatic situation to another. So that's how I got out. And that was because the whole thing disbanded. But it took me 14 more years to really wake up and realize that I'd been in a cult for 7 years, and then I had never broken free of the cult mindset. It had still, they say it's easier to get the cult, get out of the cult. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it can be easier to get out of the cult than get the cult out of you.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to a church as we left the community, and they said, we understand about cults. They did not understand about cults. And so they did not help us and actually did us a great disservice. So a great deal of my life, how many years? That's like going on for 20 years, just, you know, involved with these situations, more than that actually, without getting the right help. So that's how we left. That's kind of the potted history of the cult involvement. And I call it a cult. I don't call it anything else, really. It is a cult. It was a cult. So, yeah. And that's how I got out.
I'm so glad that you did get out.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
That sounds just exhausting and scary.
Yes, it was very scary.
Could you maybe explain a term that you used, which I think people will find interesting, when you mentioned that you didn't end up going cult hopping, although it was a possibility you could have. Can you explain that to our listeners? What cult hopping, what's that about?
Yes, I think what I've seen often is that when we don't really understand the kind of control, coercive control, spiritual abuse, the religious trauma, whatever we call it, that we can be blinded to similar situations, but they look so different. So, you know, a coercive control, this is a term used in the UK, coercive control. It's really kind of at the moment, it defines domestic abuse in the UK. It's worth looking up, actually. People don't know about it. But so basically the packaging can look different, but actually the dynamics are just the same. And that's the danger of not really understanding. And the danger for me was that, if I had no clue what had happened to me. I just happened to marry a very kind person, but it could have really been different. And that would be cult hopping, not recognizing the dynamics, but just thinking the packaging's different.
Right. I know I've had folks come to my seeking my services, and they maybe grew up in a very almost militantly Christian home environment, and they rejected all that at one point, but then ended up in a yoga type of cult situation. And then it took years for them to recognize, oh no, this feels very similar. This is not what I want at all. And it seems like so many cultic type leaders share personality types. You mentioned narcissism with the fellow who had done the takeover of the group you were in, and then was the James Bond type of person. And I see that so really often. He wanted to be.
Yeah, he really wasn't.
Yeah, the narcissism, and then also with so many cult leaders, we see them controlling people's sexuality, and often saying who can have sex with whom and when or how often, or just even breaking apart couples, families that have been together.
That happened in the community. So actually the women, even the married women, were in a room separate from the men, and some of the men, they weren't gay or having sex with each other, but they ended up sharing rooms and sleeping in the same bed. All because, I think it was divide and conquer, really. I think if there's a couple, they might, whatever sexuality, they might talk. And so the leader couldn't countenance that.
Yeah, wow. It's incredible that it was the group of women, pardon me, kind of in his personal harem, in his household there, who spoke amongst themselves and recognized something was amiss and then confronted him on it. That could have gone a very different way. And it's just fantastic that their courage ended up being something that broke the group wide open.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And then you left and went back to your family on the other continent. And they, I imagine, were very glad to have you back. But then you left to return to the group to kind of see for yourself if it was really what was going on there. Your parents must have been worried for you when you went back to it.
So I know the group actually completely disbanded.
I see. Okay.
So it's a very unusual situation and puts me in actually, in terms of the work that I do now, a strong position because I don't have people hassling me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so it was unusual, but it really disbanded in the early 80s. The whole thing just collapsed after this leader was challenged. Some of them tried to carry on with it, but no, we went to another church, which didn't help us, but I didn't actually go back. But it was 14 years later before I started to investigate what is a cult. And I saw a leaflet, actually. It's about 1995. I saw this leaflet that was describing something about cults. And I thought, oh, my goodness, I'm ticking every single one of these. And I started then to wake. I think we wake up on different, like in layers. Well, I did. And I think a lot of people do. And that's when I started to really investigate, as many of us do, what is it that has happened to me. I tried to find a therapist. So this was 1995. I tried to find a therapist here in the UK. There were no trained therapists working with former cult members who knew anything about it. And so I decided Like, people would often open up to me. They still do. People would meet me on the plane. They tell me their whole life story. I seem to, I don't know if it's my face or what.
Same here.
You have the same. I can see it. I see it. I can feel it with you. And so I thought, well, maybe I do have something here to offer. And maybe this is something to explore in terms of training and a profession. So I started, I actually had some counselling when we finally left church behind. I had some counselling with my doctor, my general practitioner, which was it's very unusual. That doesn't happen now. But she was very kind and very supportive and pointed out my all or nothing thinking. And I said to her, I think I want to be a counsellor, but I don't think anybody should be let loose on me, or I should never be let loose on anyone. I felt so messed up inside. And she said, actually, I think, if that's what you're feeling like doing, you should definitely go and get trained. So I thought, wow, because it's unusual to be supported and encouraged in these settings. People aren't wanting you to fly and do something that you love to do. They want to keep you doing their thing, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I did a diploma in pastoral counselling, and mainly because I was still so cultified, I couldn't countenance doing any other kind of training. I hadn't gone far enough in my journey. But I met for the first time, probably, or nearly for the first time, met the most amazing trainers who were Christians and who got me to think for myself, and who were really balanced, and they were kind. And when I told them that everybody should counsel people for 3 hours at a go, and they nearly fell off their seat. They're like, what? And that's what I'd been indoctrinated with, or you pray for people. They're like, no, you don't do that. That's not what we're teaching here. And no, we don't counsel people for 3 hours in one go. And they were great. They were really a part of my exiting, and a really good example of good people.
And were these the folks at Wellspring?
No, this was a pastoral counsel diploma. Of course, you have different trainings. I mean, they're different across the world, but a diploma was a 4-year, quite intensive counselling training, but with kind of pastoral and spiritual reflection in it. And it helped me to transition out of, because we'd left church, but it helped me transition out of the church and into a more sane way of approaching counselling and my life in general. And then I went, in 1998, that was completed, that diploma. And actually, somebody on it said, I put the cult thing aside as I did that first training. I thought, I just want to train to be a counsellor. I don't want to be entangled with any particular thing. I learned to counsel depression and bereavement, and I worked at a rape crisis centre. So I worked there for 11 years in the end. And that's where I cut my teeth on, working with trauma. And then someone offered to pay a bit of money towards a trip to an ICSA conference, the International Cultic Studies Association. So I went to that in 1998, actually, and I saw Paul Martin speak, he was the founder and director of Wellspring. And he gave a talk about how disgraceful it was that the churches thought that the antidote to being in a cult was to get people into church. And I'd never seen anyone so hopping mad and actually not afraid, because I was still very afraid. And I just thought, oh, wow. And I met other people. Margaret Singer spoke at that thing before
Wow.
she died. And it was actually called Jonestown 25 Years On, What Have We Learned? That was the title of the conference. It just happened to be that. I had no idea about the significance of that few days. And then I had just finished my dissertation, which was, what do pastoral counsellors need to know about cults and ex-cult members to be effective helpers? Little did I know this was going to be kind of a theme that ran then through the next kind of 25 years. But, and so I sent it to Wellspring, kind of going, hello, I'm here. I need training. There's no training. Where do you train to do this work? And Paul Martin was a very kind person, and they went, yeah, sure, just come on over. So I went for 4 weeks in 1999. My daughter, who was 10, came, and we had such an adventure at this beautiful Wellspring Retreat Centre. And I wrote a diary. It was confidential. I didn't put any, client information or anything, but what they were teaching, I wrote this thick diary in detail every day. What have I learned? What has come out of and I attended the daily counselling sessions. The clients let me shadow Paul Martin and Ron Burks. And we had fun. We went to the movies. We had lovely meals. They had somebody looking after them. And my daughter and I stayed in a room in Albany, which is is in quite close to where Wellspring was. And it was amazing. And I made then a lifelong friend of Paul Martin. He sort of became a mentor and a friend, and he came later and stayed with us. And and then I returned to Wellspring in 2008, and I had my master's by then. So I did a master's in Gestalt psychotherapy because I was able then to do a secular training.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a group-based training because I knew I had stuff I still needed to address within myself, of the trauma of being in an abusive group like that. And I also started to have therapy, and I had probably 20 years of therapy with this wonderful Gestalt therapist, which was why I ended up doing Gestalt. And I'm glad I did, because a lot of the theories have been really helpful in my thinking. So in 2008, I went back to Wellspring, and probably shouldn't have, but was allowed to work with clients, which was amazing. And Paul shadowed me. Honestly, when I went there, I thought, I've landed on my home planet, basically. They're all weird like me. And they made jokes about things that I'm like, yay, that's a joke I get, that's a funny joke. They had little cartoons on the pin board in the office. Yeah. So that's how I got to Wellspring. And really, I cut my teeth. It's the foundation of what I do now, with those experiences and going to the ICSA conferences, because there's some really good people in ICSA. There are some people who attend who I definitely don't agree with, but there are some real gems of people who attend, who write, who speak. And so I kind of made that a second home as well.
Right. Wow. What a journey you've had.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
I did a PhD then.
Wow.
And the reason I did that was because I wanted to do it. I didn't want to get to 80 and think, why didn't I do that? I wanted to do it. I didn't know if I could do it. Look, I didn't think I could do that. And even on the PhD, my supervisor would have me in tears, me going, I can't do it. And she's like, well, you are doing it, so just keep going. I said, no one thinks I can do it. And she said, well, everyone thinks you can do it, except for you, apparently.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was a big stretch for me. I didn't do well at school, and I had gaps in my, um, my education because I was in a cult in my 20s. I mean, it's nothing like second generation who have massive, big gaps, but it was still a gap. And, I'm not putting it on the same level because it isn't, but the sort of 20s, university, that sort of thing.
Right.
So, yeah, I got the PhD. And also I felt that it was necessary to try and to have a voice. And for me, it was necessary to say, look, I put in all this work, and this isn't to ex-members. I'm not trying to have a voice to ex-members. This is to maybe the government or to other academics or to them, not to people who need counselling. They don't need all that bullshit. But yeah. So I did that. I did a lot of hard work. It was 12 years, really. And I trained as a supervisor. So, there's been a lot of training. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder, can you talk a little bit about why it can be detrimental for people who leave cults to plunge right into church settings, believing that the answer is there?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, if they've left a Bible-based setting and so loaded language, which is one of the components of thought reform or brainwashing, you can leave one Bible-based setting and go into another, and it can be incredibly triggering. It's like walking in a minefield because you're here. If you've had the Bible used if the Bible's been weaponized against you, then you go back into a setting where they're telling you the Bible is the answer to the problem, but they have no idea that actually this has been weaponized against you. And so it's incredibly triggering and incredibly harmful for people. And this naive idea that somehow this is the solution. Actually, there's a whole lot of other stuff to unpick and unpack. And also, like if someone's coming out of a yoga group or something and they think, oh, I'll go to church instead, and the church doesn't understand that they've been in this coercive situation, then it's probably just going to end up being controlling and end up, potentially being abusive because that person hasn't understood their cult hopping in effect. They're going into another setting where they're meant to be something. Yeah, I mean, you have to fit. You have to fit in, don't you? You do, and unfortunately, that's a real challenge for churches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it takes us time to become comfortable with our own autonomy. And I largely work with folks who are second generation. So people who didn't join their group as adults, but they were born into the group. For anyone who's listening and they're not sure about what second gen means, that's what we're talking about. And I include myself in that demographic, having been born into a very religious family. And it takes quite a while then, or it can, for us to actually discover or uncover ourselves, our core self, and learning about what we like and dislike, what we are good at, things that we don't want to be a part of. And it can feel so scary to actually be in the driver's seat of our own lives when we've been told, and I'm speaking as a woman, being told that our place was to submit to our husband's authority or the leader's authority. And when you hear that often enough and see it modeled around you, it can feel scary to try and live any other way than that way. And of course, when anything goes wrong, which things do, because this is life and things don't always go the way we hope, then we can be so quick to put the blame on, oh, it's because I was sinning. It's because I wasn't submitting. I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. And that can take a long time to unpick that kind of conditioning.
Beautifully put, yes. And I work with a lot of second and multi-generation and a few more first generation recently, but mostly it had been lots of second and multi-generation. And I agree. And kind of in my research for my master's and for the PhD, and building on Paul Martin's thinking of what he called the cult pseudo-identity, he wrote a really interesting article way back with a psychiatrist in a book on dissociation, and they put forward this idea that of this cult or cultic pseudo-identity. And I've really run with that idea because I think that, and I've seen it, and it works for first and second generation, although I think he was mainly writing for first generation, which I mean people who joined a cult is first generation, for people who are listening. But just this idea, you have to be something you're expected to be, and that person you have to be within whatever that cultic setting is, I call the pseudo-identity. And I think we introject that. So an introject is something we take into our system without chewing it over. We're sort of taking in what we're told. You have to believe this, you have to act in this certain way. And I think that kind of introjected stuff that we take in sits in our system undigested, and it builds this kind of identity, which I sort of see as overlaying what I call the authentic identity, and what you beautifully, described to me just then, that we're not being who we truly are, or my real me, as one SGA said, second generation adult. So I kind of, in my thinking in post-cult counselling and everything, the whole thing is tied up really with freeing the authentic identity. And that was the name of my thesis, which it was, freeing the authentic identity, and phases of recovery and growth, and that sort of helping people to really, the nub of the work is freeing the authentic identity so people can make their own decisions about their life. But I agree, and even for first generation who've been in a cult for a long time, it can be very difficult to be in the driving seat. So I don't know if that's clear what I just said.
Something that we are seeing a lot of in North America right now, and I would say particularly in the United States, people in their, say, 30s, 40s, 50s, whose parents have been sucked in by QAnon. And people come to me and say that they are seeing their parents change before their very eyes. Their parents are no longer the compassionate, welcoming people that they always were. They're becoming much harder, more militant, more fundamentalist in their own thinking. And maybe they were never even religious to begin with, but very authoritarian. And it's causing so much heartache and heartbreak over here
in the UK.
Yes, unfortunately.
I'm not going to name things, but believing those aspects of QAnon that you think belong to North America, not to the UK, because it's about North American politics or Russian politics.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend not to have worked with QAnon. It just, no one's, approached me who's got out and wants to do post-cult counselling.
And that's the work that you do, the post-cult counselling.
Yes, post-cult counselling is the name of the approach that I developed to help former cult members, yes. I can say more about that if you like.
Yes, I'd like to know more about that.
So, like all the things that all the different trainings and then working with former members, and and then based on the Wellspring thought reform model. So when I was at Wellspring, they gave sheets out, like worksheets, and so I even spoke with Paul Martin about setting up a centre in the UK, which and we went to see a house, and there's a whole other conversation about that, but it didn't happen. And one of the things he said to me is, look, it costs a lot of money, you have to have staff, and so what I started to do for myself was to think, actually, is there another way of doing this? So at Wellspring, they did 2 hours of counselling in the morning, and then they had like 3 or 4 hours of psychoeducation in the afternoon with Larry Pyle, who was such a sweetheart. And he died last year, which is really sad, but it happens to us all. And so what I started to do was to integrate what I ended up calling relational psychoeducation. So bringing the relational aspects of being a trained, accredited, or licensed, as it is over your way, therapist, with a code of ethics. We have to have supervision in the UK. I have 2 supervisors. So all the things in place, the checks and balances in place, but also bringing in the psychoeducation. And actually, I have a drawer here with what ended up with about 32 different worksheets. And it was growing, because you're learning all the time, aren't you? Well, I am anyway. I imagine you probably are, because you're always speaking with people. So, then I had this bright idea one day, which was, why don't you just put them into a workbook rather than having all these pieces of paper that you go right out? Yeah. So I put them together into what I called a recovery workbook. And I've used that now for years, probably about 10 years, with clients. So when somebody comes to me for post-cult counselling, what they're coming to do is the relational psychoeducation. And what it entails is going through the different worksheets. So the very first one is about identity. So we're really looking at what was... first generation, what was your identity before you joined? And for SGAs and for second and multi-generation is like, what's your family history? Because actually trying to connect to something that might, because if it's multi-generation, there may be no one outside of the group that they have any contact with or knowledge of. But if there is, if they literally are second generation, then there'll be grandparents or whatever who maybe weren't indoctrinated. So just to kind of have a think about the family tree. And then for the second sheet is looking at what was your pseudo-identity? Who were you? So I became very compliant. I was quite feisty before. I became very compliant, very afraid, and very downtrodden. I wasn't like that before. I was just a teenager, and then on understanding, looking clearly, what was that? What happened there? And then the final sheet, and this is only one worksheet, is who are you now? What threads are there maybe that you bring, like you said so well, what was there of yourself? Did you love music? What did you love? What were you good at? What did you love to do and you weren't good at? You don't have to be good at everything. And that would be this other sheet where we really try and pin it down and say, okay, this is who I am. I'm kind. I can be furious. I can be this. I can be that. Then the second worksheet's about what is an introject and what are your introjects. So one introject from a Bible-based setting is it's selfish to think about myself. Or it's sinful even, using loaded language. So that needs challenging. And if we don't pull it out and challenge it, then, we can just reiterate it. It just goes around our head. But if we write it on a piece of paper what's the introject, and then what's the challenge, just in a table, really. And it's very effective. And then throughout the rest of the post-cult counseling, we keep kind of drawing on those things like, oh, maybe that's your authentic identity, or that sounds like an introject, or there's a juicy introject. Let's get that down and let's challenge it. And then I look at redefining the term anger so that it becomes assertive anger and a boundary setting emotion.
Beautiful.
Drew on Carla McLaren's work and Sue Parker Hall, who wrote a book called Anger, Rage and Relationship. And then there's one about healthy self-love, and then a trauma aspect. So we look at trauma theory, and Janina Fisher's work. I love her work on trauma. She's really clear. She's got a great workbook called Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma. And then we look at what is a cult, what is spiritual abuse, because not everyone was in a full-blown cult. Sometimes it's a bit more nuanced. And then we look at thought reform. And those are the sheets that Wellspring created and I built on and built on and built on.
Okay.
Then we look at unmasking the cult leader, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. You need to look at what's behind the mask. And then there's the recovery tips and how to move forward. And all of this has been put together, and I've articulated kind of what I say in the sessions into my book, Walking Free from the Trauma of Coercive, Cultic and Spiritual Abuse. So.
Wow. And people can pre-order that now.
Yes, it's we just heard from the editor yesterday, the final worksheet, which needed tweaking again, like the 10th time. We've had a lot of tweaking to do. She said it's going to go off for printing any minute. So that's really exciting.
So exciting. And a couple of times you mentioned the phrase thought reform, and I wonder if you're referring to Lifton's work.
Correct. Yeah. Lifton's 8 components of thought reform. So Wellspring, Paul Martin read Lifton's original book, Thought Reform and Totemism and sorry, I'm burbling now. I can't remember the name of it. So Paul Martin read the book when he was training as a psychologist, and he thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly what happened to me in the cult, because he was in a cult. And so they really pulled on that theory, and that's what I kind of learned back in 1999. And I find it the most powerful of all the tools that there are, that people are like, what? I've come from all these different kinds of cults, and they're going, yes, that's exactly what happened in my cult. And you just think, what?
Yeah. Even from all these different cults. And I think people should be made aware also that there can be family cults, family-sized cults. Cults can be very small, or they can be quite large. If we're, looking at the Moonies, say, there can be lots of, just because lots of people believe it does not make it true.
Absolutely.
And it's worth looking into when we do leave a group. We want to also, I have referred a lot of people to the BITE model by Dr. Steve Hassan, because that can really be a helpful way for us to gauge if we are, whether we're looking back at what we've left or whether we're looking forward towards a group that's on our horizon, or something looks like a really good thing or a really good group or something. It pays to take time and not jump into things again, because we can, depending maybe even on how long we were in our former cultic type group, things that feel familiar. It feels good to have something feel familiar, but just because it feels familiar does not make it good. And in fact, sometimes it should really give us pause, looking at why am I so ready to jump into this? What's motivating me? And I heard Rachel Bernstein, I think it's her last name. She has a podcast called Indoctrination. And I heard her say one time, if you're wearing rose-colored glasses, a red flag just looks like a regular flag because you're not going to see it. And I think that is so brilliant, because that is how a lot of us go through life with our rose-colored glasses.
I mean, that's the cult hopping thing, isn't it? Really? That we're not. That's lovely. Both the bike model and Rachel's stuff. Yeah. Really good stuff.
Very good.
Yeah.
We just have a few minutes left. Would you tell us a little bit about Hope Valley and what you're doing there? What kind of people might reach out to you for help?
So Hope Valley Counselling Limited is my company, and I live in the Hope Valley. So, and it's a beautiful place. My website has photos from the area. They are genuinely, and some of them are mine. And yeah, so basically it's a service, a counselling service where we offer post-cult counselling. I used to offer general psychotherapy and stuff, but look, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going to use my final years of working doing specializing. I've trained 13 other former cult member therapists to work with post-cult counseling and the recovery workbook. So I did this training. I called it a certificate in post-cult counseling. And it's put on by me. It's not accredited by a university or something, but they're using the workbook really effectively. So we're kind of a referral service as well. And, when the book comes out, I'll probably just get busier. I'm not sure. I'm so busy. I get so many people contacting me. I'm sure you're the same. So, it's kind of logistical thing of, now I've written the book. I have a bit more space to take people on. And so that hole's getting filled very quickly. And then making the referrals to these wonderful, wonderful other therapists. And they're a mixture of people who've retained their Christian faith, but they like Wellspring actually, who did, but they don't talk about it at all. They completely respect the boundaries, but if somebody is keeping a Christian faith, then I guess they can facilitate a conversation around that. I mean, there's so many different types of groups. People who've been in so many different types of groups contact me. Coaching, Bible-based, New Age, Hindu, Moonies, all sorts. Yeah, because the post-cult counselling works all across the board, and family and one-on-one coercive control. So yeah, it's a very flexible model actually, and the book it's in the book now. So I don't know where that's going to go, to be honest.
Well, I'm going to order your book as soon as we're done. Because it just sounds tremendous. It's thank you for taking the time to put together such a fantastic resource. And I do know a couple of American folks who have taken your course, and they both just have raved about their time with you and what they learned, and they're so glad that they went through. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Maybe just tell folks how they can find you.
So my website is www.hopevalleycounselling.com. But we spell counselling differently in the UK, and it has 2 L's.
That's the Canadian way also.
Oh, is it? Oh.
Yes.
Or put Jilly Jenkinson in and you'll come up with stuff. Yeah.
Right. And Jilly with a G.
Gillie.
Very
unusual. Good. Gillian, but Jilly. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has just been a delight getting to know you. And I want to thank you, everybody, for tuning in to us today. And I'll have more information in the show notes. And don't forget to pick up your tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma happening in October. Thanks, everyone, and do take care. Thanks, Jilly.
Thank you.